Before we begin. Okay. As it's 2 past noon in Boston. Is that where you are, Vincent?
I am, thank you. Cambridge, just outside Boston.
Cambridge. And 2 past 1700 GMT here in London. We're going to begin. And thank you so much for joining us for Ben's Digital Book Club. We are very honored to have a special guest today, Vincent Brown. Vincent is the Charles Warren Professor of American History and the Professor of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. He directs the History Design Studio and teaches courses in Atlantic history, the African diaspora studies, and the history of slavery in the Americas. Vincent is the author of The Reaper's Garden, Death and Power in the World of Atlantic Slavery, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2008. He's also the producer of Herskovits at the Heart of Blackness, an audiovisual documentary broadcast on the public broadcasting service, PBS series Independent Lens, and most recently is the author of the book we're going to discuss today, Tackys Revolt, The Story of an Atlantic Slave War, which was published by Belknap Press in 2020. When the outbreak of COVID-19 happened, we at Benjamin Franklin House thought that we should react quickly and digitally. We know that Benjamin Franklin said he was born a couple hundred years too early. Something would be made of his passion for technology and innovation. And we thought that hearing from authors would be a distinct pleasure and a privilege to get insights into their mind and their stories. So that's how we began this series. And this is a great way to start 2021 with our very first Digital Book Club of the year. So Vincent, maybe start by telling us about, the overview of the story and what got you interested in it.
Yeah, sure. Well, as some of you will know, Tackys Revolt was the largest slave revolt in the 18th century British Empire. Happened in Jamaica in 1760 and extended on into 1761. And it coincided with, and was in fact part of, the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as North American colonists came to call it. That European World War between England and its imperial rivals, most notoriously France, in which the Great Britain kicked France out of Canada, also kicked France out of India, and they fought around the world in a number of other places. Tackys Revolt was staged by hundreds, perhaps thousands of enslaved rebels, and resulted in the deaths of about 60 slaveholders. And more than 500 of the rebels, and with another 500 plus exiled off of the island. It was especially a worrisome and problematic event for the British Empire, because Jamaica was Great Britain's most profitable and most militarily significant colony in America. We often, especially in North America, think of the 13 colonies that became the United States as constituting Britain's American empire. But Great Britain actually had 26 colonies in America, and by far the most important of those, certainly judged in terms of the kinds of profits they made and the kinds of military power they had, were those colonies in the Caribbean. The historian Trevor Bernard has estimated that the average worth of a free white person in Jamaica was 58 times that of a free white person in Massachusetts. So you get some sense of the relative significance of these colonies in the political economy of empire. So this revolt in 1760 into 1761 was really at the very heart of Great Britain's empire. I got interested in it partly because it had largely been left out of stories of the 7 Years' War. So, in Fred Anderson's big, I think 700-page book about the 7 Years' War, which is largely comprehensive, one of the best books on the 7 Years' War that we have, it doesn't mention Tackys Revolt at all. This despite the fact that many of the same soldiers, sailors, Marines who fought in more famous battles of the 7 Years' War, like the Battle of Quebec, or like the conquest of Senegal, or the battles in Martinique and Guadeloupe, also fought to suppress the rebels in Tackys Revolt. So for them, it was really part of the same war. And I thought that it should be part of the same war in my telling as well. Another reason I really wanted to tell this story now is because, it hadn't really been told in any detail, but for a single article by Michael Creighton in the 1980s, since the first telling of this story by the planter historian Edward Long, who himself was a witness to some of the events of Tackys Revolt, but was a slaveholder who absolutely hated Africans and Black people more generally, and gave us the first account of this revolt in 1774 in his 3-volume History of Jamaica. So I thought it was about time to revise that narrative understanding, which historians had largely followed for a quarter millennium. The third reason is there's a very active campaign in Jamaica right now to try and make Tacky, one of the leaders of this revolt, a national hero. There's a man named Derek Black X Robinson who for the last 13 or 14 years has been doing a commemorative walk trying to raise awareness of Tacky's revolt in Jamaica in order to make him a national hero. And so I'm hoping that the book in some ways informs people's understanding of these events as they discuss the merits of making Tacky a national hero in Jamaica. And even though I'm not Jamaican and don't necessarily have a stake in the outcome of that fight, I was hoping that the book would be useful and helpful to discussions of that national history for Jamaicans. And then finally, perhaps contradicting what I've just said, I see this event not being merely part of a national history, but as being something that can help us connect up the geography of the Atlantic world in concrete ways, so that we can see Jamaican history as African history, the history of those people who were transported, forced to cross the Atlantic during the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved in Jamaica, and then rose up in Tacky's Revolt. I want to see that African history playing out in the Americas so that one could see the connections as they took place in the Atlantic world.
So the story is, set in Jamaica, but of course, as you're saying, it begins in Africa. So take us back to the origins of that story, because they are the key figures are individuals that were known to their communities before they were captured and then, displaced against their will in another part of the world, where they had to then uh, find their sense of how they could navigate this new world in which they found themselves, and the rivalries, the internal rivalries that developed.
Yeah. So as I said, I wanted to see this revolt in Jamaica as in some ways an outgrowth of African history. So it meant kind of taking seriously the fact that these migrants, coerced as they were, had histories in Africa that in some ways they brought with them. At least they brought with them those experiences. And I wanted to have a sense of what those experiences were. So just to kind of set the scene for you, about one of the reasons the West Indies were so profitable for the British Empire is because these were plantations growing commodities for export, principally sugar, which was the most profitable crop of the 18th century. Now, this crop took enormous amounts of labor to cultivate. And so you always had a very active slave trade. Wherever you were growing sugar, it generally depended on the 17th and 18th century on a voluminous slave trade. So 90% or so of the populations of these Caribbean territories were enslaved. And at this period that I'm writing about, anywhere from, probably 50 to 3/4 or 80% of that enslaved population had been born in Africa. So it became crucial to me to think about what their history was. Now, part of that considers how it is they were caught up in the slave trade in the first place. And this gets us into the interconnections of the Atlantic world that I'm trying to impress upon readers. One of the ways the slave trade operated, was through war captives. So African states or polities had their pre-existing conflicts. And one of the principal products that Europeans traded into West Africa, among other goods, were firearms, guns, which increased the scale and lethality and intensity of these wars, but also increased the number of war captives who were then sold to the Europeans who ended up on these plantations in the Americas, right? So many of those captives themselves had been involved in those wars or had been displaced by them. So they had military experience, or at least the experience of evading different kinds of wars. And that military experience wasn't suddenly forgotten when they came to the Americas. So you had many of these people who had been soldiers in Africa or had military experience of some kind in West Africa regrouping in the Americas, regrouping in Jamaica in the context of Tackys Revolt, and then staging their revolts against plantation society, which had their knock-on reverberations around the Atlantic world. So what I'm trying to see is how Tackys Revolt was a kind of eddy within these larger currents of Atlantic warfare that included imperial warfare, like you saw in the 7 Years' War, but also included these African campaigns of expansion and conflict that these people brought with them.
So, indeed, it is a book that is about human rights history, about social history, but as you're saying, it's also military history. And you make an important point in the book about how slave revolt is a type of warfare that hasn't necessarily been recognized as such by historians.
Yeah.
Talk a
I
little
mean,
bit about that.
oftentimes kind of when we go to categorize our history, when we go to give it a genre or a subgenre, we tend to think in terms of national history. We've got our US history, our British history, our Caribbean history, and then we may not think about the connections. Or we think thematically in terms of what's social history, what's cultural history, political history, or military history. And oftentimes those categories, those genres are indexed by certain kinds of events, certain kinds of people, in certain kinds of places. So in the case of military history, these conflicts between slaveholders and their slaves had not really been considered military history, that chiefly was concerned with formal battles between, formally constituted state military forces, and not these battles between kind of, state militaries and improvised militias. So I wanted to kind of really use the tools of military history to think specifically about strategy, tactics, territorial claims, and battles for this other kind of conflict that's not usually considered by military history. Once I did that, once I made that choice, other things became kind of obvious, which is that slavery itself, right, is always an enterprise that demands enormous amounts of collective violence. And it was recognized even at the time. I cite Olaudah Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vasa, one of the most famous formerly enslaved abolitionists of the 18th century, who said that when you make people slaves, you compel them to live with you in a state of war. And he wasn't the only person to make that comparison or to say that slavery itself is akin to a permanent state of low intensity warfare. So once I decided that this could be told as a military history, it was easy to see that slavery itself was a kind of state of war, right? Amorphous, informal, as it may be, but something that should be considered within the terms of military history. And that brought a lot of things together. So it was no longer just a slave revolt between, say, masters and slaves on a plantation or in a particular colony, but I was able to see the revolt on this larger canvas across the Atlantic. I was able to draw upon military sources like the sources of the Royal Navy, which was instrumental to policing this revolt. So that really opened up new avenues for studying the slave revolt in a way that I think probably should have been studied much earlier.
It's probably a counterintuitive thought for most people that the slave holders were not all powerful, that these vassals were able to exploit an opening that allowed the revolt to take place. How did that happen? And why didn't that happen in other places for as long as it did? Uh,
Yeah.
uh,
I
in
mean, there are two separate questions there, both of which are really important. The first is that, nobody's all powerful, right? And the fact that, some people try to make themselves invulnerable, try to kind of make themselves gods, really just suggests the degree to which they feel, right, kind of brittle and beset and not powerful. One of the reasons why slavery always took so much violence to maintain is because the slaveholders were themselves beset. The more enslaved people they had around them, 90% in these Caribbean territories, the more violent they got, right? And so you find kind of, the militia everybody that's white in these colonies, everybody that's a slaveholder is required to do militia service, right? And they drill several times a year. And then you have the British Army stationed there, not only to defend the island from imperial enemies like France and Spain, but also to defend slaveholders from internal enemies, the enslaved. And then the Royal Navy, emerging as one of the most powerful military institutions of the era in the 18th century, also instrumental to helping to suppress the enslaved, right? So one sees this as a conflict in which, because slaveholders are outnumbered, they're mobilizing the entire force, power of the British imperial military in order to maintain their position. And the British Empire was pleased to do so because slavery was so profitable.
And how did Tacky and the other leaders of the revolt hold out so long? Because that's really impressive that it was almost 18 months,
Yeah.
that they were able to uh, maintain their positions. How did they achieve that? What were the circumstances that gave rise to that? And why didn't it succeed ultimately, as it did in other places where those individuals could have held on to Jamaica, and the history of that place would have been written very differently than it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, that's great. So, I mean, always with these kinds of struggles, one has to take account of contingencies. And the contingencies are many, right? So I talked about how many of these people had military experience, at least enough of them in order to kind of strengthen the resolve, to have some sense of shared tactics, to understand military tactics of the British as well, in order to stage their campaigns. Now, they stage those campaigns on particular territories, right? And so Jamaica, because it was particularly mountainous, because much of the island was still uncultivated, there were places, cracks and fissures in the landscape beyond planter power where people could coalesce and stage their revolts. That's so if you compare it to a place like Barbados, which is generally flat and by this time was generally cultivated across the entire island, there was far less room to maneuver on the part of potential rebels in a place like Barbados than there was in a place like Jamaica. Now, that said, you also asked why they may not have been able to take the entire island. And it's true that they probably thought they could, and the British were afraid that they might. But what did not happen, as in the case of, say, Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti in the Haitian Revolution, is the ruling class didn't fracture. There was no kind of, English Revolution in 1760 on the scale of the French Revolution in the late 1780s and 1790s, which, set the French against each other, giving the enslaved a larger opportunity to exploit those fissures. There were different kinds of fractures among the British, but nothing on the scale of what happened in Saint-Domingue. And so you didn't see that kind of major opportunity there. The British coalesced. They had a kind of larger force comprising the militia, the army, the navy, but also allied maroons. And that maybe takes a little explaining for some of your listeners, which is that, there had been rebels before in Jamaica. And during the late 1720s and through the 1730s, these kind of communities of escaped and rebellious former slaves that were called maroons fought pitched battles against the British and were so successful over such a long time, the British did not know that they would be able to keep the island. So they, in fact, signed treaties with the Maroons at the end of the 1730s and the beginning of 1740s, which granted the Maroons some autonomy, right, in their different places, especially in the mountains, but also by treaty engaged the Maroons in the policing of future slave revolts, which they did. And so in the case of Tackys Revolt, the Maroons were instrumental to helping to suppress the revolt for the British in order to maintain their own autonomy, right? So that's where kind of these conflicts among and between different groups of Africans come into play. Once one takes the politics of Black people seriously in this, not assuming that all of the enslaved are always politically aligned, but understanding that they have their own political maneuvers, right? Communal struggles among themselves. That's how you can really see the dynamic of these conflicts playing out over time. That explains some of the contingencies of why they succeed or fail at various moments.
Let me just remind our listeners that you should give us your questions in the chat, and we're going to get to those before long. I also wondered if you could talk about how what was happening in Jamaica maps to the larger picture of Britain's position on slavery, because there was no, by that time, already in the late 18th century, while the slave trade was still going on outside of Britain's borders, there was no slavery as such on the territory of Britain. So it's a kind of strange juxtaposition that the moral outrage that grew over time with people like Granville Sharp and someone who was very instrumental in Franklin's thinking, a Unitarian minister named Richard Price, who was sharing important ideas around, why this was an abominable practice that needed to end. But there does seem to be a kind of tension between not on our soil, but it's okay other places.
Yeah. So Tackys Revolt was very much part of that debate, kind of when it erupted and the way it was suppressed kind of entered the debate over slavery itself. In this period, right, most of the slaves that Britons held were held in the colonies, right? There were some enslaved people working in England and some small communities of free Black people. This is before the Somerset case that established, or at least purported to establish, that because slavery had never been established by positive law in England, slaveholders from the Caribbean couldn't bring their slaves to Great Britain and expect to hold them, expect the British state to defend their property claims. That happens in 1772, right? Before that, it's still pretty clear and assumed by the slaveholders in the Caribbean that they can go back and forth, right? And that even though we don't have major slave plantations in Great Britain, those plantations held by Britons, right, happen to be in the Caribbean. I think when you kind of refuse that categorical distinction between what's happening in the UK or what's happening in Great Britain and what's happening in the colonies, one sees how, the money and power that derives from slavery is largely fungible. So many of the people who have set up in great homes, who have seats in parliament, also have investments in colonial territories that are based on enslaved labor. But you asked about the abolition movement and when it gets going. So kind of the abolition movement is based partly on this idea that, the emerging idea that slavery is becoming an abhorrent practice. And when many of those people who are feeling this way, especially Quakers, see the kind of brutality that's used to put down Tackys Revolt, they're almost more horrified by that brutality than they are by the rebellion itself. At the same time, on the other side of that, one of the other things that feeds the emerging anti-slavery movement is this fear of those Africans, a kind of xenophobic fear of Africans as potential rebels. So you see in North America, for example, some of the first legislation passed to regulate the slave trade, special duties on imports of Africans, is passed as a security measure, right? A kind of anti-immigration security measure in order to control the inflow of potentially dangerous rebels. So one sees the rebellions in the Caribbean mention the early legislation in Pennsylvania, for example, right? In Virginia, in the late 1760s, the legislature tries to pass a number of special duty laws, which are disallowed by London because London is more concerned with the interests of the merchants than the interests of the legislature. But this is something that Virginia planters, even though they're slaveholders, would like to pass because they want to regulate the number of what they think are potentially dangerous Africans coming in. So Tackys Revolt has an indirect influence on the anti-slavery movement, the anti-slave trade movement that way, as a kind of instigation for this fear of insurrections. So that's one thing. It's also important to remember that there were kind of lots of circuits of information and news going on. So people knew from the planters what was happening with the slave revolt, and that came into their understandings. And they, if they didn't sympathize right with the planters, they might empathize with the enslaved, but that didn't necessarily make them anti-slavery.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Gold Coast Africans and their background as uh, Coromantees
Mm.
and how that had an impact on their leadership and how the enslaved peoples engaged with one another during the course of the revolt?
Yeah, great. So what people were called Coromantees from the Gold Coast, roughly what's now Ghana in West Africa, had a kind of notorious reputation in the Americas for being rebellious, but also for being highly sought after. British traders had long relationships on the Gold Coast, so they'd been trading on the Gold Coast for a long time. They established a number of forts, most prominently Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast to trade for slaves and other goods. Um, and they kind of named these people that they got from this region, Coromantees, after a slave trading fort that had been important in the 17th century of Coromanton, right? Coromanton fort and town. And ever after, they named a lot of the people, most of the people that they traded for in the Gold Coast, Coromantees. So it kind of became an ethnic category, both ascriptive, but then also kind of understood by Gold Coast peoples themselves, who consisted of people speaking Akan, Ga, Adanme languages, understand by themselves as a kind of ethnic category in the Americas, because they spoke similar languages or worshiped similar gods and recognized similar kinds of political authority vis-a-vis other Africans, right? They coalesced, right, as Coromantees. Now, the Gold Coast was, in this era, a particularly war-torn region of West Africa. From the kind of late 17th century, second half of the 17th century, there had been a kind of military revolution, partly fueled by the massive increase in the sale of firearms from Europeans. And as I said, the kind of scale and intensity of these wars increased, right? So a lot of those military veterans who came out to the Americas and then staged revolts helped to give the Coromantees a reputation as being, as slaveholders thought of them, being particularly implacable. And this revolt in Jamaica in 1760 was one of the largest of those Coromantee revolts.
And just before I get to some of the questions that have come through the Q&A, so please, listeners, continue to put these in. I just wanted to come back to something you said at the beginning of your remarks, how you're not Jamaican, but you hoped the book would provide some insights into this important history. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you would like to see is that, ensuring that it's in the curriculum? I, don't know to what extent it may be already, and what other ways it should be recognized in contemporary Jamaican society today.
Yeah, so too, I mean, I'd love for it to be recognized kind of in Jamaica as what I think is probably the most extensive, fullest account of this important event, and an account that's not written by a slaveholder who was who was unsympathetic to the enslaved. So that's important. There is also, as some of you will know, a young adult novel by the writer Alex Wheatle called Cane Warriors. That's also about Tackys Revolt. So I kind of see this as part of an emerging literature on this event that I think will inform people's understanding within Jamaica. I also would like it to inform a broader understanding of imperial war, slavery, and race, not only for Jamaicans, but for North American readers, for British readers as well. As I said, historians often call the 7 Years' War the first European World War. And this being one of its major battles should be considered alongside the other campaigns that we normally think of as comprising the 7 Years' War. So for example, the British Royal Marines were newly reorganized in 1755 for the 7 Years' War. And they fight some of their first amphibious campaigns in Senegal, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Jamaica, right? So the Royal Marines developed their first amphibious strategy fighting Black people in the bush. I don't think that's something that's well known in British military history. I think it should be. For our Benjamin Franklin aficionados, we've learned, and I don't think I've learned anything that's overturned this judgment since, that the first reference to the use of electricity for purposes of torture is against rebels in Tackys Revolt. The planters who were experimenting with electricity, as Benjamin Franklin had been, were experimenting on these spiritual counselors to the revolt, what were called obeamen, shamans who administered loyalty oaths, and were said to confer spiritual protection on the rebels. The planters decided that what they wanted to do was impress these shaman with their own spiritual power. And in order to do that, they tortured them with electricity, which was kind of seen to be kind of new and even mystical and magical technology. I don't think we have an earlier reference to the use of electricity for torture than Tacky's Revolt. So it features in the history of torture, in the history of science in that way. Worth noting that electricity is used for torture before it's used to light anybody's house, right? Sad as that may seem. So again, kind of seeing this event as part of this larger history for a number of different curricula, I think would be kind of important.
Absolutely. Okay, so one of the questions from Sis is, and you touched a little bit about this in terms of the role of the Maroons, but the question is, would you say that Tacky's Revolt was similar to the tactics used in the Maroon Wars?
Yeah, I do think so. Again, kind of developing as the quality of firearms develops over the course of the 18th century. But yes, I mean, they're using some of the same tactics that they had been using in West Africa on the landscape of Jamaica. And I even project forward in the book, you'll see there is one image of a firing drill that rebels used from Suriname. And this is from the 1770s, but I think it was kind of largely similar kind of tactical arrangement that you find in 1760 and that you may even find in the 1730s. So the answer is yes. I mean, they're using similar tactics in West Africa, in the Maroon Wars, and in these rebellions. The key question there is kind of, can they get their hands on weapons? And that's why you see the very first battle in Tacky's Revolt is the rebels take the fort at Fort Haldane in the parish of St. Mary, where they take all the weapons they can from the fort. And then when they go upriver to sack various plantations, the first thing they're after is the guns on those plantations. Sorry, you're muted, Marcia.
Yeah, there we go. I'm just noticing that in the chat function, a colleague has said that they're writing in from Panama and wanted to note that there were Maroons there also, that they were called Cimarrones. Maroon communities also existed in Florida, Dismal Swamp in Virginia and North Carolina and elsewhere, and that those communities are featured in Clandestine, The Times and Secret Life of Mariah O.T. Reddick, available on Amazon, who was Damani's great-grandmother.
Yeah. So that's fantastic. I mean, anywhere you had slavery and large communities of slaves, you had communities of escaped enslaved peoples and runaways. So kind of one of the largest of these, you will know, is the state of Palmares in 17th century Brazil, which existed through most of the century as largely an African kingdom. So the history of marronage is kind of, interesting throughout the Americas. It wasn't just in Jamaica, it was all over the place.
And another question about the Maroons from Carol Hector Harris. Can you explain what it was that prevented the Maroons from seeing the benefit of unifying with the revolutionaries against the planters and the British military?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, that's a protracted war through the 1730s wasn't just taxing to the British, it was taxing for the Maroons as well. And one of the reasons is that the British had access to supply chains that the Maroons did not. There's another great book on a rebellion that happened in 1763 in Suriname, right, against the Dutch. And Marjolein Kars, the historian of that revolt, kind of makes the point that one of the things that the empire is able to do is to starve out the rebels, right, is to cut them off. And I talk a lot in Tacky's Revolt about the use of the Royal Navy to cordon off and secure different parts of the island, right? so they can kind of keep, supplies, certainly weapons, but also food from coming in. They empty the parish of slaveholders, of the white population, and then they start burning food crops, right? Trying to make it difficult to survive. That's one of the things you can do with a long logistical supply chain that was harder to do for people like maroons. So to get more directly to your question, the maroons knew how tough it was to win an extended campaign like that against the British. And maintaining their autonomy, right, in the mountains by strategically aligning with the British at various points, I think seemed to be a better bet than trying to take on the British Empire yet again in a war that would be uncertain.
And we've got a couple more contemporary questions, but let me ask you one from Michael Bundock. What can you tell us about Tacky himself and his personality and his role in this story?
Yeah, so we don't know that much about Tacky. We know that he led the uprising as it first started in the parish of St. Mary on the north side of the island. That part of the uprising lasted about 9 days, or Tacky himself lasted about 9 days. And that first part of the uprising was extinguished in about 2 weeks. Then there were uprisings in other parts of the island, most consequentially in the parish of Westmoreland, on the leeward side of the island to the west. And that was led by other people whose names we now know, Wager and Simon most prominently. So Tacky was just one of a number of African leaders of this kind of large island-wide revolt. But Edward Long, who wrote that first account of the revolt and published in 1774, kind of identified Tacky as the principal leader, and ever after we've known it as Tacky's Revolt. What I try to do in this book, although I call it Tacky's Revolt, is to show you a much broader array of leaders and fighters in the revolt that gives us a kind of more general sense than just a revolt led by one person. So I'm trying to, in some ways, kind of guide us away from the understanding that this is Tacky's Revolt, even though that's been the title for the revolt for the last more than 200 years.
A kind of corollary to that is, why did it take so long to tell this story? You've mentioned that it's been omitted from an examination of the 7 Years' War. There's been other uh, parts of the story told. For example, the cover of the book is, and I see it behind you, is this wonderful illustration from maybe a graphic depiction for young people about the story. But why didn't it come out sooner, or why hasn't it received the kind of scholarship before now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's got a complicated answer, I think. One is is paradoxical, which is that because there was an early account in 1774, people think of that account as a standard fine account. So they didn't really kind of go back into all of the other sources. There's one article by a historian called Michael Creighton, about a 10-page article on the road that's not bad, but didn't really kind of extensively go back into the other sources besides Long. So Long's account has essentially stood for the revolt. So people knew of it, but didn't think that there was a reason to go back and kind of paint it on that larger canvas in the way that I have. But it has been, especially part of the folklore, especially in Jamaica, and especially in the parish of St. Mary, for a very long time. So as I say, that campaign to make Tacky a national hero within Jamaica is something that grew out of the kind of folk understanding of this history that had survived and had been passed on from generation to generation in Jamaica itself. So it's not that nobody knew the story. It's just that people establishing curricula didn't take it that seriously as something they needed to regard outside of Long's understanding of it. Now, when we go to understand that, I think part of the reason for that is that this was a revolt by African rebels, not a revolt by Creole elites, right? As kind of one would see, say, in the American Revolution. It's not a revolt that created a brand new state, right? So nationalists didn't necessarily see it as something that they kind of had to regard as the origins of the modern Jamaican state. This seemed to be something that kind of belonged in the past and didn't speak to the present in the way that, say, Sam Sharpe's rebellion that happened at the very end of slavery and helped to precipitate the end of slavery in the British Empire seems to speak more directly to the modern Jamaican president. Sam Sharpe is a Jamaican hero now, right? So it was just a kind of like, folkloric event that could be well enough explained in the Edward Long account. What I've tried to do is by showing how Tackys Revolt connects up the geography of the Atlantic world in the way that it does, to kind of remind us that African history was fundamentally important to what happened to developments in American history. So, historians of the Atlantic world kind of know and often say that something like 3/4 of all the people who migrated to the Americas up to about 1800 migrated from Africa. And yet we know much, much, much more about the impact of European history on the development of the Americas than we know about the impact of African history on the development of the Americas. This book is an attempt to help write that balance a little bit.
So someone's been waiting patiently to ask the question about, what can we learn from this? So this anonymous attendee has said, in what ways can knowledge of those many revolts help African Black people's plight with oppression today globally?
Yeah, so that's great. One of the reasons why I think we haven't taken kind of African history seriously enough, despite the fact that, the vast majority of people who migrated to the Americas before 1800 were from Africa, is that, our basic conventions for thinking about whose history matters and why are kind of handed down from a historiography that privileged the understanding of European elites, right? So kind of even before the historical discipline is established on its modern foundations, the philosopher G.W.F. Hegel, who in many ways establishes modern philosophy, proclaimed that Africa forms no historical part of the world, right? That there's no dynamic movement, there's no kind of forward-moving spirit there that one has to regard as being part of world history. And it turns out that when the historical discipline is established, right, history is mostly the history of European states and kind of, descendants of European states. It's not really until the mid-20th century and decolonization, right, that we get serious engagement with African history and its development and its influence on the rest of the world. So we're kind of starting behind, right, already with that. So to go more directly to your question, for people to think, right, that African history doesn't matter and that therefore, by extension, Black history is not a subject unto itself that matters, is inconsequential, right, is already a way of diminishing someone's value. To say that you are not a historical subject, that your actions, your intentions, your agency does not matter, right? It's a way of devaluing those descendants of Africans. And I think that by telling this history, and telling it in a complex way, right? And it's not just a celebration, it's not a romantic view, but by telling this history and showing that it matters to know what happened, why it happened, how these histories of transformation were really made by a huge array of actors, including Africans and their descendants. I think that helps us understand that we are all historical actors, right? It in some ways kind of removes the initial racism of the establishment of the historical discipline that we've been contending with for the last several hundred years.
So Miles has asked a question in regard to slavery and commerce. So he writes that he sees that the cultivation of sugar, nutmeg, tobacco, and other products was the main factors in slavery, not owning enslaved people directly in and of itself. So what correlation can we make with modern day slavery, human trafficking, we might add into that mix as well, in regard to the mining of certain elements that Miles is pointing out here that we use for our smartphones, like cobalt, nickel. I also know there's something called coltan that is mined for our smartphones as well. So what would you say about that?
So good question. I mean, one wants to think about processes of exploitation which are ongoing, right? A kind of imperative to reduce as much as possible the labor costs that go into manufacturing a thing so that the merchants can sell it at the highest possible profit, right? And the financiers can make the most possible profit off of it. And so that process, right, did not end with the end of African slavery in the 19th century, as you know, right? I would quibble with your initial assumption, though, that slavery was more or only about that economic process, in order to say that slaveholding itself also becomes a kind of process of self-making, right? So to have someone who is subject to your will makes you a certain kind of person who can exert their will and mastery, right, more freely in the world, okay? That is not just an economic relationship. That's a relationship of honor and dishonor, right? It's a relationship that's as psychological as anything else, right? So when one thinks of, say, Orlando Patterson, the sociologist Orlando Patterson did a massive study of slavery, ancient to modern, in 66 different slave societies. It was published in 1985 under the title Slavery and Social Death. And he defined slavery there as the permanent violent domination of natally alienated and generally dishonored persons, right? So even when you see slavery removed from, what we call capitalist social relations, you see that permanent violent domination is a part of it, that low intensity state of warfare that I alluded to earlier, but also, right, a relation of domination which includes natally alienated people who don't have a legitimate legal relationship with their own kin, with their own progenitors and ancestors, and they're generally dishonored, right? And that general dishonor is also something that survives slavery, right, among people who are marked by their descent from slavery. So in the case of the Americas, right, people who show, phenotypical evidence of being descended from the enslaved, Black people, right, are often marked out for general dishonor in law, right, and general exclusion from the benefits and protections of the state and law throughout the Americas, right? So again, like that relation of domination is more than just economic. It takes on another character that one has to think of far more broadly. So it's a great question.
Someone else has asked about whether the revolt was talked about at the time it was happening in the colonies.
Oh yeah. So I mean, in the book, I kind of go into the news accounts that you see. I drew a lot on the Pennsylvania Gazette, who was publishing articles about it in South Carolina, and I think in Virginia as well. They were studiously avoiding publishing news of Tackys Revolt in the paper. Although I know from shipping records that people who had been exiled from Jamaica, who'd been participating in the revolt, or at least swept up in it and captured, were exiled to South Carolina and Jamaica and other places. So we know through word of mouth, the news of the revolt was traveling that way. And then, as I was saying earlier, people talk about it in their both anti-slavery and pro-slavery debates, right? So Tackys Revolt is fundamental that way. It was also important, and I think this is especially important for people who are thinking about North American history, in the British policymakers' consideration of how empire was going to work after the 7 Years' War. So they'd been establishing a new colonial policy, right? Really from 1748, they've been rethinking it. And then in the 7 Years' War, right, as they looked at the cost of the 7 Years' War and the difficulty of administrating all this new territory they were going to have, they reorganized their empire, right? And those reorganizations are part of what the North American colonists revolted against by the 1770s, right? One of the key things in their consideration was this revolt at the very commercial heart of their empire, right? So we haven't really thought of Tackys Revolt as being part of British imperial managers' considerations, right? But it very much was. And so in that way, it indirectly informs our history of the American Revolution as well.
David Walter has asked an interesting question about, and noting that the book has become part of his personal reference library, you'd be pleased to know. And he wants to know about the consequences of whether such a situation as described in the book and the kind of lasting implications of that around the question of reparations. So he's saying, where does this particular part of history put the question of reparations? As you exposed a complex situation where equally enslaved, displaced populations take different decisions to secure their own interests and freedoms.
Yeah. So I'm not sure where it places the question of reparations. I mean, that kind of depends on the relationship between activists campaigning for reparations and the states that they're campaigning to, the states that they're appealing to. You know, I remain kind of agnostic on the question of reparations, in part because I think that the entire demand, the claim, depends on a redistributive state that is kind of more egalitarian than the states we have now. A redistributive state that seeks kind of redress and repair for the entirety of its populations as the goal for the state. And, you know, I actually think that the states we have now in the West are far more predatory than that. And so I'm pessimistic that a demand for reparations could ever be made successfully to these predatory states.
How should we think about how this history fits with the issues that we are grappling with as societies today on both sides of the Atlantic, certainly in the United States, in the wake of events that took place last year with the killing of George Floyd and this uh, lack of a, in a perfect world, we are all tolerant and accepting of one another, and we acknowledge our mistakes, and we move forward with equality, and equality. But we know that that doesn't always happen, and certainly the situation that occurred nearly a year ago just brought that to the world's attention. So how do you see telling this story? And you pointed out, it's such an important story for the history of a nation, for looking at how this connects up in a contemporary way with the 7 Years' War and things that were happening in other places and how it's been left out. But where do we place it in relation to events that we're struggling with today?
Yeah, I mean, so it's always difficult to say, you know, something that happened in 1760 as a direct kind of causal link to something that's happening in the 21st century. But having said that, you know, we do want to think about kind of underlying trends and currents and logics that are continuous, you know, from our past. And I think one of those is what I've been calling lately kind of anti-Black militarism, following scholars like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who see the kind of differential exposure to premature death and vulnerability as constituting race itself. To make that even clearer, we go back to what I was saying about slavery itself being a state of war, in which, you know, slaves were always seen as potential enemies of the state, potential enemies of civil society and disturbers of the peace, against whom kind of massive amounts of collective violence were warranted to keep them in subjection. Now, unfortunately, the kind of generalized dishonor, the logic of keeping the enslaved in subjection doesn't end with emancipation, right? That logic extends to the descendants of the enslaved, where keeping Black people in subjection remains a priority of these various post-slaveholding states. And I do think that anti-Black militarism is one of the kind of longer legacies of slavery that we should probably be contending with much more directly.
So I want to, with the 5 minutes that we have remaining, ask a recent question and then one of the earliest ones. So Damani has asked about your research and given its focus, what your take is on the major premise, if you know Dr. Gerald Holmes' The Counter-Revolution of 1776, namely that the American colonists anticipated that Britain would outlaw slavery. So that's one. And then someone asked at the beginning of your remarks what your current work is focusing on. And can we look forward to another book before long?
Yeah, the second one first. It might be a while. It took me more than 10 years to write this book. I'm hoping that the next one can be written faster than that. I'll talk about what it is in a minute, but first let me answer the counter-revolution question, because I think it's important. I think that thesis informs the 1619 Project, which has been kind of important and controversial in the United States and raising the awareness of slavery, and also helping people to rethink that early period of American history. I don't think much of the idea that the British were already about to abolish either the slave trade or slavery in the 1770s. Planters in the Caribbean hated the Somerset decision as much as planters in Virginia did. Were even more vociferously against it, right? And knew that slavery was in fact expanding in the Caribbean. Its profits were expanding in the Caribbean, right? And but for kind of the blip in the 1780s, right, when the anti-slavery movement really kind of picked up steam, but then kind of ran aground on fear of the Haitian Revolution, the profits of slavery in the Caribbean were expanding, through the end of the 18th century, right? And then, of course, slavery itself didn't end until the 1830s in the British Empire. The British, expended, enormous amounts of kind of military power to suppress slave revolts, including Tackys Revolt here. Now, one thing that was quite different was that the British had long experience in the Caribbean of employing Black troops, and one of Gerald Horne's other books, he talks about this, of employing Black troops, and that was far more controversial in North America. So the British employed more Black troops than the Americans did in the American Revolution, and the North American colonists hated that, right? The North American, especially the Southern planters, hated that. But that didn't mean that the British Empire was on the verge of abolishing either slavery or the slave trade. In fact, I think if you read Chris Brown's book, Moral Capital, which to me is like the best book on the slave trade abolition as a social movement, he credits the American Revolution as a spark which really got the movement going in the 1780s, as slavery itself became a kind of, denouncing slavery became a way of enhancing the moral capital of people who make the argument, right? As people debated slavery during the American Revolution, it became a subject of debate in a new way. And these reformers kind of latched onto that and made a moral claim that the empire could only be righteous if it fully abolished slavery. That's something that happened really after the American Revolution. It didn't necessarily precede it. So kind of my take on that is quite different. Being a Caribbeanist, I just don't see the British ready to abolish slavery in the 1770s at all. In fact, in 1776, there's a major slave conspiracy in Jamaica that's suppressed by the British.
And then,
you asked for the final book. My next book is going to be a book about the African diaspora, a kind of larger synthetic book, mostly about how it is that people within the African diaspora reconstruct a history of connections that includes Africans all over the world, really from kind of, the earliest times to the present. So a big book, but I'm hoping not to write it as a textbook so that it won't take me 20, 30 years to write.
Wow, well, this is amazing. Thank you, Vincent, for sharing so much erudition with us. And the book is fascinating. Please, if you don't have a copy, get one. And we have had a question about how it can be stocked in the UK. So we'll make sure that if we haven't answered that question fully, that we do. And let me just say that if you're interested in joining us again, our next event is taking place on the 3rd of March, which I think is a Wednesday. Our next digital book club, and it's George in London Into the Streets by Lucy Ingalls. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And once again, Vincent, thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you. Appreciate it.